I'm delighted to introduce Professor Ross Garnaut, who's our next stellar speaker in this climate change show. He's so awesome, he's even named his own report, the Garnaut Climate Change Review. He's led Australia policy thought. Not only that, he's been an Aussie ambassador to China. He's even been a chairman of iDEA, which I think is a gold miner. He's always generous with his time as an Australian advisor. We're delighted to have you here with us, doctors, to make us all that much wiser. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant, and very good to be here with you. I won't talk much about the science of climate change, because with your science background, you'll have been following that as closely as me, and I won't talk much at all about the medical risks associated with unmitigated or weakly mitigated climate change, because you've been talking about that and working on it yourselves. I want to talk particularly about policy and about the critical juncture in climate change policy that the world is at and that Australia is at. My feeling in thinking about these issues at the moment is that I have to pinch myself to make sure I'm awake when I think about the situation we are in. With my family, I spent Christmas and New Year in the border areas of France and Germany, and the Bavarian Black Forest, and then in Alsace. This is the 100th anniversary this year, the centenary anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. So I spent Christmas and New Year reading some of the big recent histories of the war, Christopher Clark's epic, The Sleepwalkers, Margaret Macmillan. We are living now through these months, these days, the anniversary of critical steps towards the outbreak of the First World War. Now, we all know as history that the First World War destroyed European civilization as they then knew it, and caused Europe to embark on several decades of barbarism. The great empires that embarked on that war, the Austro-Hungary, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, weren't empires at the end of the several decades of barbarism that began in 1914. And as we tick off the anniversaries of those steps towards July 28, 1914, 100th anniversary, on about the date the Senate votes on the repeal, the new Senate will vote upon the repeal of the carbon laws, I can't help reflecting on what the modern reflective history tells us, having gone through all of the records, the notes of conversation, the correspondence of that time. Critical people taking decisions on each of those steps actually knew that it would be the end of European civilization as they knew it and as they wanted it to continue if they kept taking those steps. And yet, no one ever saw the next step as the critical moment that would bring it all undone, and the rest is history. And I think that we're in the process of taking steps of similar dimension. Obviously, not Australia alone, any more than the leaders of Serbia or Britain or Germany or France or Russia or Austria took decisions on outcomes alone, but it took everyone's decisions to end up in the disaster that began on 28th of July 1914 and didn't even end at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had a big flow-on effects after that. So I live these days surprised that we're in the position we're in, but reading the history, less surprised, because humanity has acted like this before. It's surprising because the science is clearer, stronger than it's ever been. Most of the people who are playing the critical roles in blocking effective action say they believe in the science. But nevertheless, the scientific reality is consistent and should be giving us pause. If you read the News Corp press, you might, and not anything else, or an Australian might think that a pause in the increase in temperature started in 1958 and continues today. Well, those of you who read the scientific literature know that it didn't, that's a figment of News Corp and other centres of distortion of the science. And not only is the science clearer and stronger, but the evidence of manifestation of climate change in warming, in changes in rainfall patterns, complex changes, greater energy in the atmosphere in extreme events, the drying of the southern, drying of the Mediterranean latitudes predicted by the climate science as the different energy in the systems causes the westerly winds that bring winter rain south, something that's particularly severe in the southwest of Western Australia, but we're feeling it all over southern Australia. The rest of the world is responding more realistically to all of this than Australia is. The rest of the world is moving forward in action and is a bit shocked that Australia is moving backwards. In that period in Europe, at the beginning of this year, I spent some time with the people who work on these matters at London University, Nicholas Stern, and others working with him, and the leading climate scientists in Germany, for example, Joachim Schulnhuber and his team at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research Impact. And they pressed upon me the significance of Australia moving backwards, that we've missed a lot of the early deadlines for strong global action, but there's another big deadline coming up. Quite a number of the major polities and economies of the world are moving towards an attempt at a much stronger international agreement at the Paris meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change in 2015. The presidents of the United States and China have agreed to work together on a strong outcome in Paris. The governments of Germany, the United Kingdom, and France in particular are putting a lot of domestic political as well as international diplomatic effort into a strong outcome. It's hard work because in every other country, not only Australia, you have vested interests who will be hurt in the short term by effective global action on climate change, and they fund political opposition in those other countries as they do in Australia. It's hard work, it involves political contests in every place. And Stern and Schulnhuber and others pointed out to me that the job of those seeking to respect the science in policy action in Europe and North America and China is made significantly harder if those resisting effective policy action point to a significant country that happens to be the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases per person. Australia is moving in the other direction. It's the more surprising that we're headed this way when you think that since the middle of 2012, we've had in place a set of laws which aren't having the damaging effects on the economy that those who warned against them said that they would, and which has changed, the whole set of policies taken together, has changed the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. At last, total Australian emissions are heading down after many, many decades of consistently rising, except in deep recession. And we're not in recession now. We've got continued economic growth, and yet in 2012-13, total emissions in Australia were a bit lower than in the previous year. That is a radical change of trajectory. The expectation was that with business as usual, without strong policies, Australian emissions would have been a fifth or more higher by 2020 than they were in 2000. So we've got policies in place that are starting to do the job, starting to change the trajectory of Australian emissions, not doing yet all that they need to do, but the job has begun. Doing this at moderate cost. And we've got legislation that's been passed through the House of Representatives that repeals laws that are the basis of that beginnings of action. There is a promise, but not yet legislation, not yet detailed proposals, that there will be something else in place called direct action. We know a little bit about that, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And what we know, we've only been able to look at it very recently. What we know is not at all reassuring. The established policies that are working are based around 4 institutions that are slated for repeal or amendment. And those institutions are the Climate Change Authority, the Carbon Pricing Arrangements, the Renewable Energy Target, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Now, not every one of these is working exactly as I recommended. Therefore, I think they're not perfect, but they are doing the job at reasonable cost. As a set of policies, they can get us where we need to be. They can allow Australia to do its fair share in a global effort that will actually deal with the problem. I'll just say a little bit about each of them. The Climate Change Authority, slated for repeal, is based on the British Climate Change Committee. I quite shamelessly copied the British arrangement in my recommendations on this question because they're effective in Britain. They're working well in Britain. And the principal objective of the Climate Change Authority is set up as a statutory authority is to take out of the heat of day-to-day politics the professional job, the technical job of recommending on what Australia's targets should be in the light of what other countries are doing, to recommend on what would be a fair share for Australia in emissions reduction targets in the light of what other countries are doing and in the light of recommendations emerging from the science. Climate Change Authority, as established under law, will not set targets. It will make recommendations which can be overruled by the Parliament. But if it does its job well and is doing its job very well from a technical and professional point of view under the chairmanship of Bernie Fraser and with Anthea Harris as chief executive. It will develop standing in the community that will make its recommendations highly influential. Just as the Reserve Bank's recommendations, well, decisions on interest rates can be overruled by the Treasurer, but the Reserve Bank has standing in the community that makes overruling the central bank a rather big thing, so governments think twice about doing it. Well, the setting of targets in the light of what other countries are doing and the requirements of the science is, first of all, highly technical. Secondly, it's always contentious because it will affect powerful vested interests. And so, just as in the setting of interest rates, you're more likely to get sound analysis if in the first instance you've got transparent, highly professional analysis guiding recommendations that the government of the day, through the Parliament, can override if it disagrees with them and if the government has the confidence of both houses of the Parliament. Just a bit on our targets. Both major parties contesting for government in Australia took to the last election policies that were identical on targets. And those targets are actually based on my 2008 recommendations. And the 2008 recommendations and the targets accepted by government and opposition before the last election involve an unconditional reduction in emissions by 5% from 2000 levels by 2020, whatever the rest of the world is doing, unconditional. That's the minimum we'll do. And the targets set by the government, communicated to the United Nations as Australia's commitments to the international community, are that the emissions reduction ambition will be increased to minus 15%. The ambition will be increased, the emissions will be reduced to minus 15% if other developed countries are making comparable efforts and if developing countries are taking steps that are significantly changing reducing the trajectory of their emissions. It's a balanced and moderate set of recommendations. Why the unconditional commitment is there is that it was thought to be appropriate for Australia to do something even if the rest of the world was not doing anything. Well, the rest of the world is actually doing quite a lot more than we would be doing with our minus 5%. And we've recently had the final report of the Climate Change Authority just a few weeks ago, which recommended that Australia's fair share in the light of what other countries are doing would be minus 19%. That is actually our government's commitment to the Australian people. In the terms that it went to the last election. It didn't only say the target is minus 5%, the unconditional target. It said that we will increase the target to 15 or to 25%, depending on what the rest of the world is doing. What is the rest of the world doing? Well, the two big problems in the past on global emissions growth were generally seen to have been the United States and China. The two biggest emitters, China now the biggest. The Obama administration committed to the United Nations in 2009 that America would reduce emissions by 2020 by 17% on 2005 levels. Well, that is a radical change of trajectory for the United States. The United States, like Australia, had been experiencing continuously rising emissions up until 2007. It was a radical change from earlier American positions. and the United States is actually delivering on that outcome. Canada, which has many similar interests to those pressing on Australian policy, has been more cautious in its rhetoric on climate change policy, but it has undertaken to the UN to match what the United States is doing. The European targets are much more ambitious than that. Europe as a whole, unconditional 20% 2020 levels based on an earlier date of 1990, which makes them more ambitious. But in addition, that's unconditional, 30% conditional on other countries taking comparable efforts. But you also have much more ambitious national targets in individual countries, and both Europe and the individual European countries have strong targets for future years, for 2030, 2050. Well, the Climate Change Authority has made recommendations that I think should be treated with respect. The members of the Commission are human, they're citizens, their recommendations should be debated, but they should be taken seriously, and the government has introduced legislation which has passed the House of Representatives to repeal the Climate Change Authority and to take back the setting of emissions into a purely political process. That makes it much less likely that Australia will keep up with the rest of the world in adjusting its targets from time to time. On carbon pricing, this obviously has been controversial. Controversial because the case has been made that it's been damaging to Australia's competitive relative to other countries. I've written a great deal about this. There are protections for trade-exposed industries, which means that Whyalla wasn't wiped off the map. There are also provisions for the substantial income generated from sale of emissions permits to be given back to the community in various ways. Tax cuts for low-income earners, the rise in the tax-free threshold. That's all been done. The effects of the introduction of carbon pricing on prices have been measured by the statistician, and they are consistent with the Treasury analysis that was the basis of the tax cuts, and so we can say with confidence that there was no reduction in the standard of living of low and middle income Australians as a result of introduction of carbon pricing. At the same time, industry and households retained incentives to reduce their emissions. I won't go into the renewable energy target now, but the government has undertaken a review and has made the chair of that review someone who's on record as contesting the view of the science that humans are probably responsible for a major proportion of the warming that's occurred in the last few decades. That's, for an audience like this, I need not underline the idiosyncratic nature of that opinion. So we've had repeal bills on several of the institutions, the Climate Change Authority, the carbon pricing through the House of Representatives, and the Senate has rejected those. There will be a new Senate in the beginning of July, and so it will be on the shoulders of that new Senate to decide whether the established law, which is doing its job, will remain the law or whether that law will be replaced by direct action. Now, what we know of direct action, we know from the government's green paper on an emissions reduction fund, which was released last December. I gave detailed evidence on that to a Senate committee reviewing that green paper a few weeks ago, and it's on my website, presumably on the Senate website as well. Well, even if the Emissions Reduction Fund is about having an auction the winners of which businesses will receive payments for reducing emissions in specified ways, and companies which say they will reduce emissions at the lowest cost will win that auction. One can say with certainty that even if you had the same emissions price resulting from that process as the current carbon price, the total incentives for reducing emissions would be lower. One can say with certainty that the cost to the budget would be hugely higher, and I've put them at a minimum of $4 to $5 billion per annum. Now, you have to do a lot of reduction in pensions, increases in Medicare payments, a lot of reductions in education expenditure to get back $4 to $5 billion per annum. It's a lot of money. Well, that is the very minimum. The budget cost is likely to be very much higher than that for 4 reasons. First, the government also proposes to change or to remove other institutions which are reducing emissions. So those reductions will have to be paid for as well, and that's not in my $4 to $5 billion. Secondly, my calculation is based on us only meeting our unconditional target of -5%, but our existing commitment is to do more than that, so it's going to cost much more. Thirdly, the existing arrangements allow Australian enterprises, if it's cheaper to do so, to pay for emissions reduction in other countries, to buy Clean Development Mechanism and European carbon credits. That is a safeguard if domestic costs rise too high. Well, that safeguard won't be there. And fourthly, the only enterprises which will be subject to constraints will be the very small number of enterprises which actually win the auction. All the others will be under no restraints, unless the government does something which is touched upon as a possibility in a couple of sentences in the Green Paper. It sets control levels of emissions in all other enterprises and then charges penalties for emissions above that. Now, the government hasn't said that it will do that, but it would actually have to do that, and the baselines, enterprise by enterprise, would have to be rigorous, tight baselines if you were going to hold the cost to $4 to $5 billion. So there's 4 reasons why the cost will be very much higher. And the fourth one is so difficult, controlling emissions through this mechanism in other enterprises, that it's actually unlikely that our government would even follow through with meeting our unconditional -5% commitment. So as we go through the anniversaries, the century anniversaries between now and July the 28th, sadly, I will continue to be reminded of humanity's capacity, bit by bit, incrementally, to take decisions that end up having huge adverse consequences for human civilization, and which end up putting us in a place that no one of clear mind and a modicum of positive will for the future of humanity would wish us to be in. Thank you.
Thank you for an extraordinary presentation. I know there'll be many questions, and I think we have some roving microphones. But I'll start with some of the questions that have come through on the mobile. This one seems appropriate. How does one maintain hope when things look so gloomy?
Well, I've decided that between now and the time the laws are actually repealed, I will accept every invitation anywhere to talk on them. So I'm very glad to be here today. Why there's hope is that whether you're Christian or not, there's lots of evidence that our species is capable of redemption. There have been other issues on which our country or the international community has been marching towards seriously unhappy outcomes, and the efforts of citizens in generating at first discussion and then pressure on political representatives has led to a change of course. So 1914 is not the only path. It won't be the last one. It won't be the only path until we come to July the 28th. And so I think that is the hope. In Australia, our constitutional mechanisms give the Senate the power to block legislation. Legislation is required for all the repeal and amendment bills that we're talking about. Now, there are several members of the group of independents which together will hold the balance of power after July the 1st, who people say are subject to conflict of interest because the leader of their party owes already $8 million in carbon price payments. And some people say, well, that determines the outcome. But I wouldn't have such a bleak view of humanity as that. I would think that even the senators of the Palmer United Party are capable of reflection and of decisions in the interests of Australians and of humanity.
Thank you. I take it just a brief liberty to just put something to you that the Minister said earlier today, and I just wonder what your response is to it. I don't want to misquote him, so I want to get it right. But it was to the effect of the carbon price for $7 billion that it's cost us has only had a tiny impact on lowering, I think it was either 0.1 or 0.01%, if someone can help me, but a tiny impact on lowering greenhouse gases, and therefore it wasn't a very efficient way. Would you be able perhaps to respond to that?
Yeah, I'd respond with 2 points. One is that the payments that companies have to make, high-emitting companies, so to buy a permit to emit, and the number of those permits will fall year by year, but the money that they pay for that doesn't disappear. It goes back into consolidated revenue. And that income funded the increase in the tax-free threshold, which now stands at $18,000 when before the package of measures introduced with carbon pricing was $6,000. The money just doesn't disappear. Another part of the money goes to support of renewable energy. If you like, that's a little bit of what might have once been called direct action, but funded by the sale of these emissions permits. Part goes to providing support for trade-exposed industries. So it's not 6 or 7 billion economic cost any more than the goods and services tax that you pay is a cost to the economy as a whole. That's the way in which the government funds our medical services and so on. And so one can see the sale of the emissions permits not as an economic cost any more than any tax is a cost to the economy. It's a way of funding the public goods, including medical goods and services that the Australian community wants to have. So that's the first point. The second point is it's actually an achievement of historic importance that Australian emissions are now falling after decades of rising quite rapidly. That is a huge change of trajectory. And in those sectors of the economy where the full effect of the range of policies has been strong, like just take the electricity sector, emissions fell by 7%. Now there's some parts of the economy, like agriculture, which are not covered by the carbon pricing, which are not influenced by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation or the renewable energy target. Emissions are still rising in those parts of the economy. There will be opportunities through the Carbon Farming Initiative for farmers to participate in reduction of emissions, to be paid for it by selling their emissions credits to enterprises which have to pay the carbon price. So that may lead to a reduction of emissions over time in agriculture, but farmers are not subject to carbon pricing, so unsurprisingly their emissions are still rising. So that small reduction that we've had so far is, first of all, a reversal of a powerful upward trend that's been there for a very long time. Secondly, it's the net effect of larger reductions in some sectors and continued increases in emissions in some sectors which are not covered.
Thanks. Now, we've got a question over here. Or here, we've got one. Thank you.
Bob Douglas, can I first of all express my admiration for the work you've done, Ross, over the last 8 years, and thanklessly indeed. What you've said, I think, emphasises that we are at an absolute crisis point in Australia, that we're going backwards. And I want to ask you, to what extent do you feel this is a consequence of the fossil fuel financial impact on the Liberal Party? Because that's, it seems to me, the most serious and disturbing issue. And we, I know you recently published your book and that Malcolm Turnbull launched it for you, and that Malcolm Turnbull just lost his seat by one as leader of the Liberal Party. To what extent is this a function of big business money, and to what extent is it genuinely a concern to move back to a different time by the Liberal Party?
I think the leaders of the Liberal Party had better speak for themselves. Malcolm Turnbull was kind enough to launch my book, Dog Days Australia, after the boom, and said nice things about the book, but I don't want to get involved in Liberal Party questions. But Bob, on the other question, the effect of the fossil fuel lobbies, I think this is very important. It's just one of the pressures on the policy-making process. The distortions of the science in the News Corp newspapers, which is significant. There's a recent book published by a political scientist at Oxford University, which amongst other things points out the influence that News Corp has in the countries in which it is strongest on community opinion on climate change. And of course, Australia has a much larger News Corp interest than Britain or the United States. But the fossil fuel interests have been very active with misinformation, very active with sponsoring the views of people who are known to reject the physics and the climate science on this issue. They've been important in funding political campaigns. But I don't think that determines the outcome. I think that there is a base of opinion within the Australian community still for continuing policies such as we have, and I think there's a sense in which it would be a failure of the political system to reflect community views, to replace established policies by direct action. There has been one opinion poll since the election simply on the question of if the choice is the fixed carbon price that we have now, which is quite high, the floating carbon price linked to Europe, which under current legislation we're due to have in 2015, or direct action, The one of those three that has least support is direct action, 12 or 13%. One that has most support, a majority support, is the floating emissions trading scheme linked to Europe, which we will have from 2015. But carbon pricing at the current high prices, which is an interim arrangement, it always was an interim arrangement on the way to linkage to Europe, that has more support than direct action. But our political process, our two-party system, the particular history of debate of this issue in Australia is not seeing that community reality reflected in decisions.
If we've got another hand up somewhere. There's a few up the back. I'll read one out while you're running up the stairs there. Given the evidence of large negative cost abatement opportunities, why limit abatement solely due to diplomatic considerations rather than do everything that is in our interests, regardless of what other countries do?
I think we should do as much as we can anyway, but I think we can be pretty sure of what we do on our own will not add up to a fair share in a global effort. And I think the question is informed by detailed work, good work that's been done on the actual cost of abatement in a whole lot of areas. And there's a whole lot of areas related to energy saving where the studies show that if you did actually change the way you did things and use less energy, you would reduce emissions and increase the profitability of the business. Now, an economist can't help asking if that's the reality, why aren't businesses doing it now? And one can be sure that with carbon pricing, the incentives to do that are stronger than they would be in the absence of carbon pricing. The reason that firms aren't doing it now is that it takes management time, management effort, so it's not actually costless. It takes organisational time, a management team. Say the emission saving is in organising a building in different ways. Well, if it's an established building, you have to reconfigure quite a number of things, and that not only involves some investment in new facilities, but it does involve a management effort being diverted. So let's do all of that we can, but actually it's not a totally free lunch. And probably what we're starting to see with carbon pricing is more and more of those low-cost opportunities being picked up, because wherever they've had carbon pricing, in Europe, now in California and in the north states of the United States, there has been abatement at lower costs than had been previously anticipated. And that may reflect the point that is being made in that question, that there are low-cost ways of reducing emissions if leadership of enterprises really go looking for them.
Thank you. Question up the back.
Yeah, g'day Ross, Peter Tate, thank you for very informative. Greg Hunn keeps saying that he doesn't need the Climate Change Authority because the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO are able to give the government the advice that they need. I'm just wondering what your response to that might be, please.
Well, the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, first, I would strongly endorse the quality of the work that they're doing. It's crucial, and I wish their future funding on climate work was guaranteed. Secondly, they're doing work specifically on applied climate science. It's excellent work, and it informs the work of the Climate Change Authority. But the Climate Change Authority doesn't only look at the science. In fact, it takes the science as given. There's some eminent scientists, climate scientists associated with it. One, David Corley from this university is on the Climate Change Authority as renowned an expert in the physics of climate change as any Australian, and one of the top people internationally. So he's there on the Climate Authority. But David wouldn't say that the work that he and the staff of the Climate Authority does is what the Climate Authority relies on. They draw in the output from the CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology, and a lot of the detailed work of the very strong, excellent staff that Anthea Harris has put together in the Climate Change Authority relates to studying carefully what other countries are doing, the costs of reducing emissions through various mechanisms, and you need to bring all of this into the story if you're going to make recommendations on what's the appropriate level of emissions reduction in Australia. You don't get statements from papers from the CSIRO or Bureau of Meteorology saying the appropriate rate of reduction for Australia is minus 15% by 2020. It's not their role, it's not what they're equipped to do, neither is it their statutory role by law. The Climate Authority uses that and brings in other relevant information.
Excellent. Well, look, I know there's millions more questions, but we are running out of time, and we're going to go to a break now, I believe. So we'd like to thank Professor Ross Garnaut for his generous time, and thanks very much. We really appreciate it.